38, and after watching that Thanksgiving, after celebrating Thanksgiving here recently, it's kind of worked out that after celebrating a holiday that's probably most well known for the meal and the family and the people that are around that meal, today we're going to be talking about a story that centers around a meal and three key figures at that meal. And I will say as we jump in, Luke does seem to enjoy meals. You know, maybe if you sat down and talked to him, you could have a good conversation about food because meals do seem to come up. We're going to be talking about a meal today. We're going to be talking about a meal. We already talked about a meal when Matthew, the tax collector, and Jesus went to eat with him. We're going to later see Jesus at a meal with Zacchaeus, the tax collector. And then, of course, Jesus is going to share the Last Supper or the Passover meal with his disciples later on. So again, this is a fascinating story. I think it's going to mean a lot for us with some really cool characters. We're going to look at it from a lot of different angles. But before we jump in, we did just celebrate Thanksgiving, and I have a Thanksgiving story I want to share with you. Now again, some of you have probably heard me tell this story before, but I think it just kind of works as we're kind of launching in on this somewhat embarrassing, outrageous dinner party that Jesus is about to have. So when I was done with college, I moved out to Virginia from Wyoming, moved to Virginia to go to seminary. So I was a long ways from home, and we had the entire week off for Thanksgiving. So I don't know, I probably wandered around my hall long enough that someone thought, oh, look at that poor fellow. Let's invite him over home with me for Thanksgiving. So I knew a guy, again, I'd only known this person for a couple months. So his name was Alex. He invited me to come up to New York for Thanksgiving, Binghamton, New York. So not New York, upstate Binghamton, New York. So we went up there. For the most part, it was an uneventful time. I did get to go to Cooperstown. We went to the Corning Glass Factory. I'm sure it's on everybody's bucket list. I've been there. You know, I can tell you a little bit about it. But Thanksgiving arrived, and that morning, my friend Alex was sick. He was sick. He was in bed the whole time. I never got sick. I don't know what happened. So all of a sudden, I sort of got to know his mom and dad a little bit, but in come the aunts and the uncles and everybody over, and I'm just constantly going, yeah, I'm Dave. I know Alex from college. He's sick. Yep. You'll probably never see me again. Here I am. So I did that for a while, but Thanksgiving's a long meal, so it just kind of kept going, and you're eating, and finally, I think after a number of hours, I think I went upstairs or knocked on Alex's door. Are you still really sure you're sick? Yeah, I'm sick. And he was like, hey Dave, you should just go downstairs and watch TV or something. I was like, that's a good idea. So I went and I hid out in their basement and watched TV. I don't know what was on. I don't know if football was still on at that time. There was probably something on. I also called my family, right? I called a number of my sisters, my parents. So I'm sitting down there in the basement. It's got late. I think everybody is now left. It's pretty quiet. I think I'm safe to go back up to my room. I go up the stairs. I open the door, and it's locked. So immediately, again, this story is going to tell you more about me than anything else. Immediately, I had some decisions, right? I could have knocked really hard. I could have tried to wake someone up. But I was like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to wake them up. Again, I don't know exactly what time it was. I just thought to myself, I'll just call my friend. Cell phones did exist back then, kids. So I was just going to call him, and he would just come and unlock the door. So I tried to call him, nothing. Tried to text him, nothing. So I'm still like, it's not going to be so bad. I'm from Wyoming. It's not going to be so bad. It started to get cold. And I'm like, I think there's got to be heat on here, somewhere down here, something. Anyway, just as time went on, more and more I didn't want to just start pounding on the door. And one of the reasons was I felt like it was going to be embarrassing that they locked their guest in the basement. And so in the end, I was like, I found a blanket. I made it all right. I never got a hold of my friend Alex. I spent Thanksgiving evening in their basement on this couch with one blanket I found. And even then, I'm still thinking when the next morning came, I was like, please tell me Alex will look at his phone, unlock the door carefully. I don't want this to be a big deal. Well, Someone then unlocked it, and they were like, I think this has been locked. Where's Dave? And so then it it did become a whole thing. And it was like, they were so embarrassed. I still won't even give their last name because, I mean, the shame. But, but that was my experience visiting someone over Thanksgiving and the evening I spent in their cold New York basement. So here we go, Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 36. We're going to see some embarrassing things in this story as well, or some outrageous behavior. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. I thought it was cool, the song that we sang earlier, right? That Jesus came for every Pharisee, right? Even one like me. So here we see Jesus not at a dinner table with, I don't know, the tax collectors or his disciples, but here he comes to a Pharisee's house. All right? And a lot of Bible commentators are united in saying one thing that doesn't necessarily jump out as we read just this intro verse, right? When we read this verse, it's kind of just like telling us the setting. Instead of at a tax collector's house, now Jesus is at a Pharisee's house. But many commentators will say Simon's behavior is outrageously rude. And we're going to get to that in a minute, but the idea is that a visiting rabbi has come over, and Simon is not going to offer him any water for his feet. He's not going to offer him oil. He's not going to greet him with a kiss. He just shows up and doesn't give him any of those things, thus embarrassing him. It's like Simon's mind is already made up. He invited him over, but he doesn't think Jesus is all that great. So he neglects to give him the proper greeting that he should greet a rabbi that is coming over to dinner. And again, I just imagine this Thanksgiving dinner where Uncle Joe's there and nobody wants Uncle Joe there, and they're publicly saying it's time for pumpkin pie, but Uncle Joe can't get pumpkin pie. You know, like clearly that host is saying, I don't want Uncle Joe to be here. And Simon, with his greeting of Jesus, or the way he's neglecting to greet Jesus, is really kind of showing that he's trying to embarrass him. Now, again, two things I want us to keep in mind as we get going is Luke has already kind of shown a progression of the Pharisees where they started out interested in Jesus, wondering about him, to in chapter 6 of verse 11, this is what they say. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. So at least some of them, not all of them, but some of them are furious and are trying to see what they might do to Jesus. And the second thing is that Jesus has just shared in his talking about John the Baptist that because a lot of people that rejected John, they're going to reject Jesus as well. They had one problem with John the Baptist. He was maybe too strange, hanging out there in the desert, not associating with people, eating locusts and wild honey. That's his problem. But then Jesus comes around, and he's spending time with quote-unquote sinners, right? The tax collectors, the prostitutes. And so they're upset with him. And Jesus' point is, look, if I sing a happy song, no one's laughing. And if I sing a sad song, no one's crying. No matter what we do, you're not going to respond in this way if you've already made up your mind that I'm not the Son of God. I'm not who I claim to be. All right. So there's a background to Simon and what's probably going on in his head and the way he greets Jesus. There's also a background to this woman who we're about to learn about. Let's go ahead and go to that next slide. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. So we're going to be leaving that up there for a while because we're going to touch on a number of things about that. So here's the first thing. This woman is in a difficult situation according to her culture. This is what Ken Bailey writes. He says, a sinner should first confess his or her sins, make compensation for them, and then demonstrate sincerity by keeping the law. So what this means is that the common reaction in this culture to a sinful woman or a sinful man would be, all right, I'm not going to associate with you in any way. You know what to do. You need to confess. You need to make restitution. You need to keep the law, determine not to sin, and then I will spend time with you. But the problem was, How do people get out of these difficult situations if they don't have any help from their society, right? How does one stop being a prostitute? How does one stop being a tax collector? How do you even make restitution for some of these things? It wasn't necessarily clear. So a lot of people would kind of feel trapped in a bad situation that's just getting worse and worse. Now, we don't know the circumstances, but as I study this passage and as I read other people that studied this passage, most people believe that this woman has already heard Jesus. She's heard his message of forgiveness for sinners, and she has responded in faith and has received that forgiveness. All right, an Arab Christian from the 12th century, I'm going to mess up his name, Ibn al-Tayyib, says, "There is no doubt that the woman previously heard the preaching of the Christ and was deeply moved by it, and believed and repented and was anticipating a chance to make visible her thanks to the Christ and to confirm forgiveness for her sins." So the idea behind this is she's received forgiveness for her sins. She comes here to this party. She's sitting there. She's waiting beside the wall. And then she sees the way that Simon greets Jesus. She sees the way that he is embarrassing him, how he is publicly shaming him, and she jumps. She acts. She does what we have just read about. And now the next question might be, how many of you know that Jesus is ridiculed for spending time with sinners? All right. So why is this sinner, this sinful woman, this well-known sinful woman at Simon's house? Why isn't Simon beat up for this, right? Well, the reason is, Tom Wright says, doors in this culture would remain open in this society, allowing beggars, passersby, or extra friends to wander in. So here's the idea. If they're having a banquet, the door is open, and this Pharisee Simon might say, like, line up the beggars or the sinful people. They might be lining up against the wall. They would have their meal, and then they would give whatever's left over to those who are along the wall. And thus Simon can say, I'm a good person, right? Look at all the people that I have helped. So that's why she's there. She is an uninvited guest at Simon's house, waiting by the wall to he would probably assume to eat more later. He has not invited her to be there. So again, she sees what's going on. She sees the way Simon has treated Jesus, and she acts. We can assume that she went there, assuming she was just going to anoint his hands or something with some oil. She did not come prepared to wash his feet, as we saw from that. So before we go further, we're going to do two little rabbit trails, two little asides, and our first one here is on feet. Who's excited about feet? Yeah, okay, I hear you. I pretty much ignore feet unless they're really like smelly or hurt, and then it's like, oh man, that's annoying. I didn't realize how good I had it. I think Amy showed me something recently of like someone who was like, you need to realize how good you have it, that you don't have a sore throat. You guys ever like that? Like, I'm gonna recognize today that I'm healthy, and I'm glad about that, because I always, when I'm sick, I'm like, oh man, if only I had just been so thankful when I was, feeling so well before. Anyway, that was all to the side. Anyway, feet. Two verses I want us to look at from the Psalms. Psalm 110, verse 1. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And Psalm 60, verse 8 says, Moab is my wash basin. On Edom, I toss my sandal. Over Philistia, I shout in triumph. So in a few of these in this culture, right, it's like humiliating. What could be more humiliating than being a footstool, having feet tossed on you, right? Or what could be more humiliating than having a sandal thrown on you? And again, this is, I still have a hard time grasping it, right? I think we're pretty familiar with the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet and how that was the role of a servant in their society. But again, I still am like, yeah, it's because they're dirty. No, they kind of saw him as defiled, as it was not proper to pray, to eat at a meal. It's just like not okay to do that if you haven't washed your feet. So the value, the importance people placed on feet, I had a hard time grasping, which took me on a long thing where I was researching Roman history. And look, everyone, this is not worth it. We're going to talk about Cleopatra for 1 second, and you may be wondering why we're there. Sunk cost fallacy. I spent so much time looking it up. I've got to share it with you now. So here we are. This is an aside. If you need to take a short nap, here you go. Cleopatra, you kind of know her, 30 to 50, a Ptolemy. She knew various guys. One of them was Mark Antony. To summarize it really quick, Mark Antony, Octavian, they both want control of Rome. They both want it, right? Eventually, Mark Antony, after he consolidates some power, Octavian, after he consolidates power, he's going, Mark Antony, that guy, he's starting to act a little bit too much like a Ptolemy. I think we can start to slander him. I think we can start to get some, propaganda against him. He's doing some things that I think we can attack him with. So here's one of them. Here's one of the things that one of his guys stands up and says, this is what Mark Antony is doing, and this is proof positive that Mark Antony is bewitched by Cleopatra. I mean, he's not even himself anymore. So if we wage war against Mark Antony, he's basically not there. Cleopatra is basically completely in charge. So this is how we can justify it. This is what he says. Here's the quote. This is it. Calvisius makes some accusations about Mark Antony's behavior toward Cleopatra. This is written down in Plutarch. Ready? At a banquet where there were many guests, he, meaning Mark Antony, had stood up and rubbed her feet. Can you imagine? Imagine that. That's proof positive that Antony is bewitched. Let's have a war. Let's defeat him. Bingo, bango, bongo. And now on Christmas, we hear about Caesar Augustus, not Octavian. There you go. Brought it all back around, right? Octavian wins. He becomes known as Caesar Augustus. He's the Caesar, of course, when Jesus is born. So there we go. There's feet. It's pretty important. So now you can realize, the fact that someone would actually touch feet is proof positive that they're completely bewitched and we can start a war and defeat them. So there you go. It's kind of a big deal. Kind of a big deal. That brings me to the other thing that I know even less about than feet, and that is hair. Hair comes up in the Bible and leaves many of us confused, again, because our culture is so different. I'm just going to touch on a few things. The Mishnah, that's a Jewish writing, lists the offenses that justify a man divorcing his wife without giving her a financial settlement. And on the list is speaking to a man and going out with her hair unbound. All right, so her hair's not up. Ken Bailey writes, if going out with hair unbound would trigger such a personal and financial disaster, then clearly such an act was considered an intolerable offense with dire consequences. So if taking your hair down was an intolerable offense, it was also seen in some places very pious if you kept your hair up. There's a story of a woman who gave birth to multiple high priests. And the idea was, yes, I keep my hair up even at home. So it could also be seen as like a sign of piety that your hair was up. So the point is, this woman, actually go back to verse 30, the 36 or 37 and 38 again really quick. Let's look at this one more time now that we've had this wonderful background on feet and hair. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. And again, I would argue that Jesus was treated poorly. She came over there. She feels sad about the way he's being treated. She washes his feet with her tears. She has no towel. She didn't come for that. She uses her hair, and now Simon's going, what is going on? What is this woman doing? Certainly some people would have thought There could be something sexual in the fact that she's let down her hair in this way. They're appalled, and they want Jesus to do something about it. Get this woman out of here. What's going on? Verse 39. We will continue. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. And like I said, I think his mind's kind of already made up. Ostensibly, he hasn't made up his mind. He's inviting Jesus over. But again, he's greeted him so poorly. And I think he's just looking for any way to support his belief. And so here he goes. He sees this woman. He's thinking to himself, no prophet would put up with this, so he must not be a prophet. Verse 40, Jesus knows what he's saying. He is a prophet and more than a prophet. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. And again, I want to point out, again, if he's a teacher, he should at least be treated with respect and kindness. He's certainly not treating him with respect and kindness as an honored guest. All right, so he's going to tell him, verses 41 through 43. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. Now, in Aramaic, the same word, haba, is used for sins and debts. You may think of the Lord's Prayer in Matthew, where it says, forgive us our debts as we've also forgiven our debtors. So we can read this parable that Jesus talks about in this way. We can assume that the moneylender is God, right? The moneylender is God, and the 2 debtors or sinners that are being illustrated here are Simon and the woman. The sinners cannot pay their sin debt. And now God, or in this case Jesus, right, as the second part of the Trinity, forgives them both. The question though, right, is Simon even looking for forgiveness? Does he even realize he needs any forgiveness at all in this situation? So again, then Jesus asks, who will love the forgiver of the debt more? And Simon, of course, answers correctly, the one who's been forgiven more. So again, before we go further, I think this was a good parable. This is a good story. And it's still expected that the next thing Jesus will do is criticize this woman, send her away, reject her, apologize for her actions. That's what we're expecting. We're expecting that he might say, I don't know why you're coming here to ask for forgiveness. You need to go to the temple. You need to go to the courts where the women belong and just do it there. That's what you need to do. That's not what he does. In fact, Jesus has seen that they were hostile towards him. Now they're hostile towards this woman who has foiled their plans to embarrass him. And now Jesus is about to try to take the hostility back on to himself. This is what he's going to say. Verses 44 to 46. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? Obviously he does. He's been talking about her, right? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. You see this woman, the one you've been talking about, and it's almost as if he's saying this. You see this woman, the one you've been talking about, who's such a sinner. You don't want me to associate with her, right? Because she's a sinner. If I'm not supposed to associate with sinners, should I start with you, Simon? Ken Bailey writes something else to make this dinner party really interesting. He says, never in my life, in any culture, anywhere in the world, have I participated in a banquet where the guest attacked the quality of the hospitality. So that really leaves us with an outrageous trifecta, right? We have outrageous treatment of the guest by Simon, outrageously loosing hair by the woman, and outrageously calling out the hospitality of the host by Jesus. So maybe we could call this the first Thanksgiving. I hope not. I hope your Thanksgiving was nothing like that. Again, we've seen Simon shift his attacks to Jesus, and now Jesus, someone who's about to go to the cross, right, and take our sin debt on himself, he's trying to take all the vitriol and the hatred that people have turned towards her and trying to take it back onto himself. And then this is what he tells her. He says, "Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown." And that's the argument, right? The argument is she's already loving like someone whose sins have been forgiven. She's shown great love already. He's just going to reassure her that her sins have been forgiven. She's already demonstrating a life that's been changed by Jesus. She's already demonstrating a life that's been changed by being forgiven when it certainly seemed hopeless that she could be forgiven. Jesus has forgiven her. And now the people are going to respond. They're not thrilled. Here they go. The other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this?" Verses 49 and 50. "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Jesus said to the woman, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." So, again, for many of us Christians, if you've been around for a while, you're not going, "What? Jesus claims that he can forgive sins? Shocking. I didn't know that." Well, hopefully you know that. It's really important stuff. But again, the idea could be that for some of them, they could think like, are you taking the role of a priest, right? Like, "Bless you, my child, your sins are forgiven," as like a mediator for God. But the idea here is that he's telling her, no, you've actually gone to the right place. Not that you can't go to the temple in this case, but that coming to me to thank me for having your sins forgiven is good, because Jesus is saying, I am God the Son. I can forgive you of your sins. In Kids Creek last week for Thanksgiving, right, we heard the story of the 10 lepers, right? There were 10 lepers who were healed, and only one came back to Jesus to say thank you, right? And the thank you part is important, but the other part I think that Luke time and again is trying to show is that it's also good that they went to him, because Jesus is God the Son and he is able to forgive. And we can compare that, right? And we don't have it on there, but if you look at Acts 14, when Paul and Barnabas do healing, when they heal people and people want to worship them as a god or something like that, they clearly tell them, no, it's not us. You need to worship, we need to worship God the Son. We're just, God's just enabled us to do this. Don't worship me. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus does want people to worship him. And so this woman, as well as that leper later on, as realized that Jesus himself is able to forgive. So as we close, I'm just going to hit a couple key things on the screen, and we'll talk about them as we go. So as I just shared right there, Jesus is worthy of worship. He's worthy of worship. He accepted worship, and he is worthy because he's the Son of God. He would not be worthy of worship if he was just another prophet, if he was just another rabbi, if he was just another cool dude. He's worthy of worship because he's the Son of God. The second one is that we all need forgiveness. Jesus offers forgiveness to all, both to the law keepers, quote unquote, like Simon, and to the lawbreakers like this woman. We all need forgiveness. We're going to talk about that again in a second. Number 3, I think this is so key. Jesus sees us in our hurt and our pain, and he cares for us. He didn't send the woman away. He didn't just do what the culture wanted him to do and say, go away go to the temple. You don't belong here. He saw someone who has responded to his forgiveness. He cared for her, and he tried to take the vitriol and the hatred that they were sending on her, that they were trying to point her way, and he took it back on himself. And he did that partly by calling out Simon for his terrible hospitality. All right, let's look at the next one, number 4. And this is a couple ones to think about, right? Have you been forgiven a little or a lot? And some of that, I think, sometimes can be our own attitude, right? Jesus didn't really have to do too much to save me. Like, I'm pretty good. And I think the proper way to think about it, right, is if it's a debt you can't pay, is it a little or a lot? Right? So no matter how big you want to say it is, since I can't pay it, it's pretty huge. It's pretty important then to me. But again, I think Simon's going around through his life going, yeah, I just have a little sin that needs to be paid for. The woman realizes that she had a lot of sin to pay for, but she is now loving a lot because she's realized that she's been forgiven a lot. That's something to reflect on. And then 5, my answer, Jesus' answer, is what is our response to being forgiven a lot? What should our response be? Certainly giving thanks. We should love other people the way that we've been loved. We should forgive other people the way that we've been forgiven. We've been forgiven a lot. So what is our response instead of again, we can have the wrong response when we, and I've certainly done it plenty of times, have a pharisaical Simon attitude toward other people. And then this is not on there. I just want to add it, though, in my own mind. You can write it down. Which sinner do we want Jesus to stop loving first or associating with first? Again, I think for me, I can compare and contrast, or go, that person's really bad, hope they get what they deserve. And I think this story kind of helps me to reflect and go, yeah, which sinner do I want Jesus to stop associating with first? Again, Simon has his own problems. But he's saying, yeah, Jesus, you got to stop hanging out with those people. They're not really worthy of you spending time with them. So that's one in my mind. Which sinner do we want Jesus to stop loving or associating with first? And again, as we close, I wish that more of my life looked like the response of the woman to Jesus, but I think a lot of my life, I've really just looked like Simon because I've not thought about these things. Sometimes it's because I had a relationship with Jesus early on, and so kind of looking for what God can give me, feeling pretty good about where I'm at, stop remembering how much I needed Jesus. And pretty soon, if I don't keep these things in mind, I start loving people little, or only loving the people that I think deserve it. That's not the response that Jesus had, and that's not the response he's calling us to have. So with that, let's go ahead and close.